for me, the way that you position that for max value is you make as much fucking money now as you possibly can, and you figure out a way to own your customer, right?
Welcome back, everybody, to High Touch with Jake and Duffy. Unfortunately, my partner in crime here, Jake, is under the weather, so it'll be just me. But we have an incredible guest today, our friend Seth Yakatan. We are entering an era in the cannabis industry where capital is tighter, deals are messier, and a lot of companies are discovering that maybe they weren't actually businesses, they were just stories that don't really hold up under scrutiny. And Seth is someone who has spent 30 years in rooms where those stories have to turn into assets that need to be priced and need to ultimately find buyers, find investors, so he can speak from the front lines about this process. He's raised over $1 billion, sold more than 20 companies. More importantly, he has seen what survives when those stories go away and what types of businesses turn into successes in the end. So really excited to have you here, Seth. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. A lot of allegedly in there, but it's all good, allegedly, which is kind of where I live. But yeah, all good. Appreciate being on and appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thanks very much for the time. And
Absolutely.
that was an absolutely, illustrious introduction. I'm not sure that I have the capacity to live up to that much greatness, but we'll see.
Well, I follow you on LinkedIn, as I'm sure a lot of people listening do. So I know you got greatness in there.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know anything about that. I mean, that's a whole, there's a whole robotic set of AI clones that just create my content and comment on all of it. So thank you for the follow, and I appreciate that.
Incredible. Well, I want to start by talking a little bit about the era that we've entered into cannabis. A lot of people are describing it as distinct from times in the market that we've experienced before, whether that's because we're seeing these waves of consolidation or because there's more of this regulatory change potentially on the horizon. I'd love to hear what your take is on this era of cannabis. Do you feel like it's meaningfully changing? Do you feel like it's just the outgrowth of the eras we've had before? How are you feeling about this time in the industry?
You said something in the intro about people telling stories. I have a partner in one of my businesses whose name is Tobias Rich, and I have to give him credit. He says cannabis isn't really businesses, it's just collections of assets that are trying to figure out a way to make them work. And, to your question, I think I'm optimistic. You've seen in the first quarter about as much deal activity as we've seen in the last 24 to 30 quarters, and cash changing hand in those transactions. At the end of the fourth quarter of last year, you had the first affirmatively positive signal from the U.S. federal government that something's going to happen. I'm not sure any of us know what. You also had a corollary signal about hemp that something is going to happen, and I'm not sure what. You also, during 24, had this thing called the debt wall that everyone was really worried about, and every MSO has now successfully scaled at, on average, probably 250 to 300 basis points below the rates that they were paying before. So someone's interested, right? I think it was announced that I believe Charlotte's Web got $10 million from someone big today on the tobacco side. So there's definitely signs of life. Where it goes, I don't know that my capability to prognosticate is strong, but I do feel like it's different.
Do you feel like the ultimate outcome for these businesses, obviously there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty, obviously there's a lot of questions around where the market will go, maybe we're just reading tea leaves at this point, but do you think that this sort of next phase of investment is going to be driven more by those classic pools of capital, debt providers, equity investors, or is it this section of strategics that are really starting to take the industry a little bit more seriously and, maybe tobacco or alcohol starting to invest meaningfully? Like, do you see that as a meaningful distinction, or is it going to be just kind of capital across the board?
I think you're going to see greater fools rush in. You have in every wave. I think in traditional cannabis investment, you have kind of three classes of investors. You have private individuals or family offices, you have equity funds that have been created, and you have private credit. And unless you're really sophisticated, unless you're a private equity, unless you're a very sophisticated private family office or a very sophisticated private equity fund, you're pretty much burned and you're playing for whatever you have left to get an outcome out of. On the private credit side, I think you have people that are a lot more vested and have better protection, so to speak. But there's not a lot of equity in the market. You and I interfaced a couple of years ago. You have this really amazing company that's, in this crazy torture device called Ancillary. And you have a really amazing software platform that you could deploy broadly in retail CPG. And I'm sure you've talked to 8,000 friggin' investors, and all of them are like, this is really cool, but you have this cannabis thing and I can't do anything. So I also think you have a giant amount of ancillary businesses that have either made their bed in cannabis or created a guest room in cannabis that have the opportunity to go into broader SaaS or broader CPG or broader models where I do think you'll see capital flow. No one was louder and more vocal about the upside of THC and hemp beverage last year than me. And I will, tell you that I was caught up in the growth and the opportunity. And, I went to 26 conferences last year, and probably 5 of them were beverage specific. And I saw real money in the room, right? Real strategics, real consumer private equity, like real family, like real people. So to your point, I think that, depending upon how the legislation rolls out, I do think you're going to see more capital roll in. I've always largely espoused that I think the biggest unlock is public equity. And the moment that you have, I created this double tsunami graphic a couple of years ago. The moment that you have the capability to list the first plant touching company on NASDAQ, walls are going to fall down and you're going to see things that you've never seen before in the industry. So I am hopeful. I am hopeful.
Yes, I agree absolutely. I think that the access to the public markets, not just from a capital perspective, but also from a normalization perspective, and making sure that the institutions that are driving a lot of this decision making in the political landscape have a vested interest in the industry doing well, and that I hope can be solved with some of these legislative solutions. But how do you see some of these pools of capital trying to price this like stroke of the pen risk of whether or not the legislation goes one way or the other being the outcome? Because what I've still been quite surprised by is the amount of traditional investment still flowing into hemp bev, even though it seems like there's a big hurdle to jump over in the coming 18 months around where the federal ban actually shakes out for these state markets.
I would respectfully, professionally disagree with that, because I think the only comp that I've seen that supports that in the last 2 quarters is this Willie's announcement,
Yeah.
which I haven't publicly said this. If you're a sophisticated practitioner of capital markets, let's just say sometimes the press release isn't the real story. So, if you look at that deal and you deconstruct it, two very large, very risk averse consumer private equity funds put money into a company that happens to have Willie's in it and also has two really good non-THC beverages in it that we didn't talk about in the press release, right? And as a sophisticated practitioner of the art, I don't know that there's a single person in THC beverage that had Willie's on their radar screen. And the press release said, this is the most, the biggest. Okay, well, if I annualize 1 month of revenue and I hedge $15 million because I've got two other companies that are doing great, maybe that's what happened there. So to your point, I don't see people that have not made a bet pre-November trying to risk arb the pricing of hemp. I think someone should, but you also, have kind of the valuation construct of unless you can buy something really, really, really cheap and get an outcome out of it. I think that's hard to price in, especially when you have, a bunch of physical assets from a private credit perspective, or if you follow the Chicago Atlantic model, you can be secure on a 40 to 60% LTV and make a very healthy yield. So most of the capital that I see now relative to hemp that isn't already in it is waiting. And they're either going to be really happy or really disappointed. And I don't know which one, because my capacity to prognosticate a political outcome in this industry at this point is 0.0.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very, very interesting. That's one of the biggest headline deals I've seen. And this is why we got to consult the experts to see what's actually happened behind the scenes. And, the question of where ancillary lands in all of this is obviously personally very interesting to me, but I think also is hopefully at least a bit of a forecast for where the plant touching, business investment case comes from into the future. Because my read, just based on conversations that I'm having in the operator seat, is that the growth equity world is starting to take stock of the executive order, is starting to see cannabis as potentially less regulatory risk and higher TAM than they had previously. And they're also running up against this issue where a lot of the exciting technology companies are getting outside of their price range, outside of their multiple range. All of these sort of mid-stage companies that they were previously investing in are becoming less and less common, less and less accessible. It's either these really, explosive AI companies that, to some of them seem like a flash in the pan or seem like they're overpriced. And they're, at least in my experience, starting to see cannabis as a, more of a going concern from an investment perspective. Do you, have any read on how that shift in the ancillary market is going? Or do you disagree with that read?
I don't. I mean, I think it's going to be a wait and see because it's going to be ancillary specific. And just to pick on your company for a minute, like
Please.
what I look at when I look at ancillary and cannabis is the following. Have you created a product that's needed by multiple industries and you just happen to deploy it in cannabis as your entry point? Or have you created something that's specific to the vagary of the laws around cannabis, and there's a bunch of stuff that exists outside of it that's going to show up the next day? I think if you're in the first bucket, and I think you're in the first bucket, I think you have a jailbreak of a couple people that get out of that. But and no disrespect, but like when you look at payment processing companies, I'm glad they're all doing well and they're making money and they're up. But like the day that Visa, MasterCard, and Toast can process payments, like you have ubiquitous redundant networks globally to do that. The only reason those companies exist is because Visa and MasterCard don't want to touch weed, right? So I think it's less about what, investors think, and I think it's more for me from a thesis perspective is can you illustrate to someone that this is a ubiquitous SaaS platform and the cannabis discount slash Tate that you've applied to me goes away? I'll also go back and answer one of your questions about ancillaries or about market and what people are looking at, if you don't mind. I think the latest view is that cannabis in the next 3-4 years is about a $30 billion revenue market in the US. So I talk a lot to Frank Colombo, and, he and I have worked on a bunch of information together. And I think, you know, towards the end of last year, we came up with this kind of matrix that said we think hemp's about a $30 billion global product. And we think the black market's at least about a $30 billion global product. So if you think about the industry, it's somewhere between 90 and 100 billion. If the black market goes away and hemp goes away, does all of that demand shift to cannabis? It probably doesn't. But let's just say it becomes a 70 or $80 billion, market. I have some data that says, beer, wine, and liquor stores as a retail channel in the US were 80 billion or are projected to be 80 billion in 2026. So people are waking up, right? There's a lot of guys out there that are professing that people aren't drinking less and the data is skewed. And I'm out there seeing data that doesn't support that. I'm more than willing to have my mind changed, but they're waking up. They're definitely waking up. And I think once you have the confluence of the legal restrictions, the stigma is going to be there for another generation. The legal restrictions going away. You saw with alcohol distributors ubiquitously in Trump states in 2025, they will put anything on trucks that they can sell that's legal, and the people want it.
Yes, that comp is really interesting and I think is really instructive, especially when you roll in the question of off-prem versus on-prem. You know, off-prem
Man,
off-prem bev alc is huge. On-prem cannabis, I think, is a totally unsolved problem, and it remains to be seen as to whether that is even an experience that people want to have. Curious if you have a view on, the on-prem cannabis consumption, market in the future.
so far, we haven't seen a business model outside of maybe one or two that work. And when I say work, I mean generate revenue and cash flow.
Yeah.
I've longly held as a 55-year-old consumer that you want to go to some place that's cool to hang out, and you might use substances on your way there or while you're there. I've yet to find somebody who wants to go to a cool place to smoke weed. So I think that the culture, is around scarcity of a capability to get into a venue, right? Or something that's really interesting or a really interesting experience and having all the additions of that, which is why when you go now to on-prem, beverages was like perfectly suited to slide into that market because it's part of the social fabric. And I'm a history major. Two of your three great religions have a prayer for wine, right? Like, so it's kind of like it's ingrained in the human DNA code to imbibe in something. That unlock relative to, getting product in front of the consumer, I think is huge. And it's not just stadiums and venues. Last summer, I probably went to 20 grocery stores in Iowa, and every single one had a THC end cap.
Wow.
And they were, and I do my kind of, Rube Goldberg. Hey, do you guys have them THC beverages here? Oh yeah, honey, we got them right over here. And I like the grape, and they're 2 for 1 today. So it's like, okay. Anyway,
Wow, that's really fascinating. My co-founder and I have differing views on this, but when we heard about the hemp ban, it was a really hard development to place in terms of how we felt it was going to impact the normalization of the industry going forward. Because on the one hand, obviously, we serve the regulated dispensary channel. That's a important set of businesses for us to feel are getting a fair shake and are having the promises that were made to them when they spent the massive effort and time and treasure to get a license and set up their dispensary kept, that they were going to be this point of distribution for this product, and feeling like that was something exclusive. But it really has struck me that, scenarios like that are the most normalizing place in our culture for people to encounter THC. So many people, so many places that I would not expect to be totally accepting of it have become accepting of it because it is being distributed to them in these channels that they're very comfortable with. And I feel that, it was almost a step backward in our goal of normalizing and destigmatizing, THC, that we push back on that channel. How do you feel like that's impacted the kind of, you know, the different paths that our legalization outcomes could have taken?
we could spend all day talking about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Um, Here's what I will say is that I think when the Farm Bill was created, it opened Pandora's box. And there's a guy, one of the leaders at Mammoth Distribution, the guy named Wes, and Wes has this saying that says, the greatest law of the universe is the law of unintended consequences. And I think the Farm Bill created a bunch of unintended consequences, and a lot of really gritty, really smart, young entrepreneurs ran into that hole as fast as possible. And I'm not sure they cared about what that meant, right? I think that they saw white space and they went into it, which as an entrepreneur in a new industry, you know what that's like. You're going to run through that door. I was just as shocked on that Sunday when that legislation came through as anybody. And I think it's certainly created camps around what people think. So, two things kind of became really clear to me as a result of that. It became clear to me that alcohol does not want this product to exist, period. And alcohol is a very well funded, very well organized, very powerful federal lobby. And I think you saw them flex muscle. I also think, and not many people are going to say this, but I also think you see or saw, or I know that there are a lot of regulated cannabis operators that have done everything by the book and who have spent a lot of money to maintain, a single state or a multi-state MSO or a brand methodology that also don't want this loophole to exist. So while you educated the consumer and you had uptake, and when you put the molecule, so just to stop for a sec, I think you created camps, right? And I think the camps have been created out of the hegemonious industries that you've amassed capex into and build infrastructure, and then this redheaded stepchild showing up. The shame of it is that if you're pro molecule, what I saw was that cannabis, no matter what we want to say, is still stigmatized. You still have to go through an extra step in your daily process to get it, even if you have it delivered, right? And, I'm sure you've been in hundreds of stores. Your cannabis dispensary is usually in the worst part of a neighborhood, right? And if it's not, it's very rare. So what I saw as a result of that unintended consequence is that when you put the molecule in front of the normal cycle of habits of a consumer, and I'm not just saying the Chardonnay mom, just the normal, you wake up on Saturday, you go to Target, you go to the grocery store, you go to convenience, wherever, whatever you didn't have to take an extra step. And when you remove that extra step out of the process, people are like, holy shit, I want to use this. Right. That's, I think, the sad part of it all. And I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to get rectified. And I don't know that there's a clean way to do that either, because you have a lot of really powerful forces that have entrenched infrastructure that don't know how to DTC market and don't want the couple $100 million that they've spent to build cultivation, manufacturing, brand, and retail in 5 or 6 states to be disintermediated because I can go to a gas station and buy basically bootleg flour that's hemp for half of what I can buy it from in my store. And that's reality.
It is a really interesting process to observe because it feels like so much of the moral force of the cannabis industry comes from that pro molecule stance, from the righting the wrongs of the war on drugs, and even just the idea of, sort of people's freedom of experience and freedom to decide what they're going to consume and what can be, a part of their lifestyle. And when push comes to shove, it's a little bit more oriented around what's my sunk cost here? What assets have I already built my business around? What's important to me as a business or as a shareholder of a business? And I'm very curious to see if and when we reach a federal legalization event, how are these operators pushing back against, let's say, interstate commerce? Where do we land from the perspective of actually normalizing the industry and making it a national industry versus, hey, I've got this huge cultivation, that I've built out in a state where it just doesn't really make sense to have a cultivation if we're operating in a national industry. Are there more sort of fracturings of the industry that you see in the future coming from some of these like challenges based on just like the balance sheet, the assets that people have?
Probably. I think it's going to be interesting to see what states do. I don't see a giant kumbaya moment where everybody gets along. So, I hate to say, I think it just depends, but I think it just kind of depends. You know, I don't know that there's a big fracturing. I think the way that I look at cannabis is that right now you have 15 different markets that are important. and you have a different set of operational constraints in each of those markets. And if you're an operator, you need to figure out how to be successful under those constraints. Tomorrow, those constraints might change, and you're going to have to figure out how to be successful there. And I think the smart ones are planning for that and waiting for whatever's going to happen to change.
Maybe zooming in a little bit to the actual operators in the industry, I have seen so much activity lately that it's almost hard to track. I'm curious from your perspective, if you were kind of blank slate coming into the industry today, like I think, some people are, what are the businesses or the specific operators or even the specific states that you feel like are on the best trajectory, the ones where you would want to put your capital if you were allocating it today from kind of a blank slate?
Ooh, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
I talk a lot about California. I still think California is an amazing market from a top line perspective. I think it's very hard to operate there. I talk a lot about Missouri. There are 6 or 8, 9 people in Missouri that all have really, 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 really good companies. I don't know that if you're blank slating it and trying to start in Missouri today, that you can get there. Like it's going to take you 35 or $40 million to get there. Illinois and Ohio are tough. I think Jersey is also interesting but tough. I think there's a couple interesting plays in New York. I certainly think there's some interesting things in Pennsylvania, specifically if it goes rec. And Florida's one where I'm probably out of. Texas, I'm probably out of. I definitely think there's interesting stuff internationally that can be looked at for sure. I also think that depending upon how the legislation breaks here, it seems like, let's say nothing changes and you go to Schedule 3, it sounds like there's an opportunity to potentially export or move medical cannabis product around the United States. It sounds like there's an opportunity to export legal farm bill product that would be, CBD with less than 0.3% cannabinoid. It also sounds like there's some form of medicinal product that you could move around. So I certainly think that there's ways to move in the environment, and just depends. So on that side, I think there's a couple states that are really, really, really interesting. I'll tell you the other state that I didn't mention, which is cracking, is Maryland. I haven't sworn yet. Maryland is fucking on fire. It's on fire. I don't think afterwards we'll talk, but I push out other people's research every Sunday with like my commentaries on it. And, Maryland is this state functionally where it's $1.3 billion in revenue. You have like 120-ish stores. Your average door does like 11 million a year in revenue. And there's a limit on the number of stores you can have. Like, I think that limit's going to go away. I think Massachusetts, the limit's going to go away. So I do think you have a couple states where you're going to see action just because an $11 million a year door is a great friggin' door. And if you got 4 of them and you're GTI or Curaleaf or Trulieve, you want to pick up 2 more. So, I think it's less about if I had a blank slate, where would I start from scratch? It's more about if I had existing asset bases, where would I look to be accretive with my balance sheet? That's kind of more about how I think.
Yes.
Deployment of capital is probably either in one of these new areas or non-US. It's probably how I'd answer your question.
Yeah. No, that's a very thoughtful answer. I agree with you. I think that Maryland is probably one of the most underrated states in the country from a business outcomes perspective. Not only because we, see the outcomes of the retailers there and they're, all doing incredible numbers, but it does seem like the regulatory framework is holding up. It's a good fit for the size of the state and the way the state is structured. I'd be very curious to see what happens to the Maryland market, if and when Virginia goes rec. That seems like it it would be essentially, you know, losing its position as the most southern, legalized state for folks to do their cross-border business. So I'm always curious to see how that ends up, landing for a state like that. But
I think that hegemony in Maryland's going to stick around for 2 to 3 years. I
yeah,
really do. It's hard there.
yeah,
There's a lot of opt out. There's a lot of rural opt out.
yep,
I You don't know this about me. I go into a lot of retail. I've probably been in 40 doors in Maryland, so
wow,
yeah, there's a lot going on there. Let me go back and answer the second part of your question about either models or brands, right?
mm,
Talk to a lot of companies. I think we've very clearly seen that there's two or probably three models that work. And when I say work, generate cash flow, right? So if you're a single state or a multi state cultivator and you've operated by the book and you've deciduously figured out a way to attract capital and you haven't overbuilt, you could be very profitable. So there's several ultra premium high end cultivators within the state of California. I'm just going to shout a couple out, you know, Cannabiotics, Maven, a Golden State, and I'm probably missing a few, but that for my money, like Connected, set the standard in terms of global flower production and are all at some level functioning businesses, right? So another one that I talk a lot about incessantly is Headwaters, which is the biggest company that no one's ever heard of, right? So you have several people that have been pure play cultivation into largely either bulk or brand, right? That have been very successful from that metric. I do think I talk often about, either regional single state MSOs or private multi state MSOs that bang. And, Good Day Farm, Jars, and C3 are probably the top of that list. And then you have kind of a middle tier of folks in a Standard Wellness, a Nova Farms, one or two in New York that Starbuds that kind of does okay. And then, in Missouri, you got, the Vivid guys and Beleaf and Elevate and, I Illicit and three more others there that do really well. You got Ethos, my man Gibran in Pennsylvania. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but like that model, right, where you're doing between 50 and 250 million in revenue and you're profitable and you've got it vertically integrated. There's another guy who does really well, who I love, out of Michigan and New Jersey, Quality Roots, and Eric Carr. And yo, MF, you owe me a call. Okay. You owe me a call. So there's a couple of those that do, I think, really well. I've also talked a lot about this asset light brand model and the companies that I, kind of love in that space. I think the highest iteration of that and the highest function that we've seen there is Grunwild. I've prognosticated, before that I do think you're going to see the emergence of potentially a second and third super brand platform in the industry this year because those just make sense in coming together and they're highly accretive and they're all very profitable. So, you have Timeless and Jeter and Jaunty in New York and Heirloom in New York and Off Hours. And, I'm probably missing several off the top of my head. Kiva's probably in that class and Kana and a few others there. And again, my apologies, I'm missing, several there. But I think when you see that model proliferate in a number of states, those are companies that I've seen, be reasonably successful. And I'm sure I'm too senile to remember them all, but those are a few.
that's an impressive list. Regardless, you've got a lot of them right off the dome.
And to your point, like I think the action's going to be in MSO to MSO, MSO to private, MSO to cash flow. And I think you will see more of that. I mean, I'm playing this game for that, right? I'm playing that game to be on one or the other side of those deals, at a national or an international level, because that's a game I've been playing in pharma and biotech and CPG and wellness for 25 years. So I position myself to be this thing, whatever it is, and that's what I'm playing for. And I feel like we're in the red zone right now. But I think what you'll see driving is I can't do that myself. I want cash flow, and that will permeate. And I think it will be positive for some people. I also think in our industry, there's a lot of lamentation about what I'd call the small guy. Life ain't fair and business isn't fair. I can't tell you how many early stage drug development companies I got into that I thought was going to cure cancer, and 19 out of 20 of them failed, right? So, early stage venture, and I talk about it a lot, whether it's SaaS or CPG or beverage or tech or biotech or whatever, it's just friggin' hard, or cannabis. And specifically in cannabis, you have a wide valley of death between what I call the haves and the have-nots. And you've seen in the last 2 years, that valley has expanded. And I think it's just going to get harder.
I do think that those sort of three deal spaces that you define do seem like the places where all the opportunity is going to be, at least until those really serious pools of liquidity from either, the public markets or the big strategics or, the big pools of capital can start to play in the space. I'm curious, as you're seeing those deals start to emerge with, MSOs consolidating smaller operators and single state operators, or these kind of brand consolidations, how are those operators deciding on what assets are, strategically the most valuable for them? Are these assets that are valuable but distressed and therefore they can get at a reasonable price? Are these assets that are truly the best ones in the market that are at least willing to sell? How are they actually going about, if you're, in corp dev at the big MSOs, saying, yeah, those are the ones that we're going to go after, and here's how we're going to try to structure this deal to, cash, paper, all that stuff?
Depends on the entity, because I think when you look at what I call the big three in GTI, Curaleaf, and Trueleaf, their needs are potentially different than everyone else's, right? So when you look at what they're doing, I think they're trying to move in places that they're not accretively, right? And then you have a bunch of people that are very opportunistic and taking advantage of distress. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the team at Virgo after I've been under the covers there. They're making moves that I've dreamed about making since I'm 16 years old, right? So, and they are able to do it because they have a visionary leader who sees 17 to 18 years into the future and is willing to bet on himself, just like he has at Chicago Atlantic, in order to be a forcing function in consolidation. So his methodology is a little bit different than the other three, which is, what can I buy very reasonably, and where can I pick up things that I don't have stuff? I then think, because of the amount of credit-based distress that you have in the industry, and politely what I will say, the relative disconnect in the bid-ask spread between what a traditional private credit guy on Wall Street thinks he's going to do and what the reality of the market is pretty wide. I do think you're seeing people opportunistically bidding on things. And if you just look at two very loud and public examples of that in AYR and PharmaCann recently, I don't know that everyone on the capital side got what they want out of those deals. So, if you're a buyer, it is a buyer's market. So again, I think it depends upon the needs of the organization. My sales strategy is much different than others, which is that, tell me what you want. I'm not going to force it down your throat. I'm not going to change the gears of your organization. I want you to just pick up the phone and accept my call the next time I call you, and not think I'm a total asshole, right? So like I think I've done a very good job in my career of surveying, in our industry, call it 15 institutional strategic end users and maybe 10 institutional financial end users, to determine what they think market is, right? And that is financing market and valuation market, kind of on a vertical by what's market for an MSO, what's market for a cultivator, what's market for a brand, what's market for a retail dispensary in Missouri, Maryland, Massachusetts, Maine, New Jersey, California, as a multiple, and try and understand what the box is and see how you can fit something in the box. That's my approach. which allegedly, if you leave my fucking bullshit, has caused me to do multiple deals. And I will just tell you that there are press releases coming this year. So if you believe in the aura of, whatever the fuck I'm peddling, there's more to come. I haven't even gotten warmed up yet, bro. The shoulders, I'm not even out of spring training. Season started. They got me on IR for another 6 weeks so I can bring the heat, okay, before the All-Star game. Let's go. Let's
Big
go.
time. Big
Oh,
time.
don't
The
worry.
industry needs a closer. The industry needs a closer.
There are several of us. I just tend to be loud and very self-promotional. So
Well, that's half the game. I'm curious, maybe on that note, flipping the tables, and you touched on this a little bit, but in the position of a single state operator, a smaller player, you know, the classic adage is companies are bought, not sold. But how do you position yourself to be the one that gets consolidated in a way that is beneficial to you, to your capital stack? What is it that you see the best businesses doing that are setting themselves up and are actually getting that chance?
thinking about that, right? Like again, you have 6 great companies in Missouri. Okay. 2 of them are my clients. Right? Like so I don't know that 6 companies in Missouri are all going to get bought.
Right.
So you saw Illicit do a transaction, which I think was really positive for Illicit in the ESOP transaction, and it's probably the biggest cash out ESOP we've seen in cannabis. I think you might see some more of those. I think to your question, I think you have to be preparing. I consider myself to be pretty dumb, and I kind of look at the 80-20 rule. So if you look at the models that have existed and you understand what your cap stack wants and you understand what you're good at, you know, how do you position that for max value? For me, the way that you position that for max value is you make as much fucking money now as you possibly can and you figure out a way to own your customer, right? I don't know that that means we go and do that. Like, let's say I'm a vertically integrated player in Maryland, as an example. Is that going to work in other states? Do you have a capital base to do that? Do you go to, you can't compete in Virginia. You don't want to go to DC. Delaware sucks. Like, what do you do? I think what you do is you ratchet the maximization of your cash flow, try to get as much of your capital stack off your balance sheet as you can, and find one of the 6 or 8 people that know how to do this and position yourself for inflection, right? At a reasonable number and don't have crazy expectations. I think if you're thinking that way and you're in the mix, you that's how it's going to occur. Look, you're a very successful early stage CEO who's raised a good amount of money successfully and has a pretty interesting business. So you've been through, 10 to 12 rounds of hard battles. Does someone randomly pick up the phone and call you and say, "Hey, I want to buy you for $100 million"? Sure, it does. Sure, it does. And I am going to be on the cover of People magazine one year as the sexiest man alive, too. There's a probability, but it's very low. You know as well as I do that those conversations are about years in the making and planting seeds, right? Hey, I want to get to know your company. Hey, this could be strategic. Hey, maybe we'll make an investment. Hey, you're doing something that I need. There's no randomness to that. Could you hang a shingle on and start a process? Sure. I ran a post yesterday. Cannabis is a nanometer wide and a nanometer deep. It's flat. If you know what you're doing, and you go to 1 or 2 conferences, you can be in the same room as the CEO of every single major MSO decision maker in one breakfast, right? You can't do that in pharma. You can't do that in oil and gas. You can't do that in CPJ. You can do it in beverage if you go to the Beverage Forum April 29th and 30th in Manhattan Beach, California. But there aren't too many other industries you can do that in. But so I think if you're out there and planting the seeds, it's going to bear fruit. But it's also about what's the strategic, mission. Something else, and I'm sorry to keep espousing, some people don't want to exit, man. Like some people did not create their businesses to exit, and there's nothing wrong with ripping cash out of that for the rest of your life and figuring out how to make that a legacy for what you're doing. So, the first question I usually ask someone is, why'd you start the company? And it's usually because either I wanted to solve a problem, I wanted to help people, my significant other kicked me out of the house, my buddy had an idea, or I want a big giant exit. Like there's not a
Mhm.
lot of other reasons. And I don't know that every big business is going to exit, and that's also okay. So
Wow. Great advice. Makes a ton of sense to me and definitely resonates. It is really all about building those relationships, being in a position to get lucky and having the right business when that time comes around. I'm curious, maybe shifting tacks a little bit here as we get to the close. I know you already have a meaningful focus on biotech, pharma. If you weren't investing or focusing on any of the industries that you're currently really enmeshed in, what's the most exciting to you out there? What's out there that you're like, ooh, I wish I knew more about this, or if I was starting from scratch, this is something I'd be pretty interested in getting into.
that's a great question. My whole life, I've kind of been a trend spotter. So I try not to have an ego, but I do think I see trends in specifically consumer product that are coming with the right relationships or the right investor base. You can just create something to drive it to an exit. And I would probably want to do that, quite honestly. Yeah, this is also going to sound dumb. I'm in a coffee shop. I love coffee. The decline of Starbucks has brought about the upregulation of what this hipster coffee mentality is, and no one's rolled that up yet. So I do think you have the capability from a trend spotting perspective to create a regionally cool Starbucks in a couple places in the Southeast, in the Midwest. So I'd probably spend a little bit of time doing that. But that's probably where I'd go. I've also had a crazy idea for a long time around it's gonna sound so dumb. Have you ever been to Erewhon?
Of course, I was just at Erewhon in LA a couple weeks ago. We
No,
went
next
on
time
it's like a little, it's like a tourist
experience.
attraction. Yeah, the whole experience.
So next time you're there, call me. I'd love to meet you there. So they
Yeah.
have a avocado based cacao pudding there that's vegan, gluten free. It goes for $7. Okay. There's a reason. And that's because the product degrades instantly. So the shelf life of it needs to be refrigerated and it needs to be eaten within a day or it turns black. Now, if you could seal that product with nitrogen gas, that product would stay around for weeks. So another idea that I've had for a long time is that I have another company that I've been working on for a long time, which is called Zero Cubes, which is xenon graphene cubes that have a gravitational displacement that's lighter than air. I have another one. This is going to sound totally crazy. Imagine a single use inflatable balloon deployment system. Think about it like a life jacket that goes up that you could use in a typhoon scenario where someone comes in, the water comes in and you hook yourself in a life jacket, but it hovers you to like 100 or 200 feet for like 2 or 3 hours and
Wow.
then gently lets you down. So, yeah, I mean, that's a whole different show, bro.
Wow, you had those right off the cuff. You've been coming up with ideas for a long time. That
I
that
think a lot. Yes.
Yeah, it makes sense. I do think that, when I meet people who are of a certain X factor, I guess I want to say, people who are always thinking about, oh, how could I make this better? How could I fix this? How could I do something here? It definitely shines through, and I think that's really important for anybody who's in the company building, the capital acquiring, the storytelling space. I'm curious, what's your big coffee guy? What's your coffee order? What do you typically get?
Double espresso, Topo Chico, double espresso. No milk. Don't fuck up my coffee with milk. It's just going to ruin the whole experience.
Incredible. Well, on
Before,
that,
but
yes, yes,
before we end, so tell us about how you're doing with Sparkplug.
absolutely.
I'll tell you why. We met a couple years ago. I thought you were a real hot, sexy Series A. I was intrigued. And since then, I got to tell you, the feedback that I get in market about you guys is awesome. There are
Wow.
so many people that I know that have plugged you in that use you. I think, regardless of what your stack is, whether it's, your POS to Alpine IQ to Sparkplug, it seems like for brand and for retailer, that incentivization is a real game changer. And I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. I'll tell you why. I was at a, because I think in our industry, point of sale training is a tuning fork that we haven't turned on. I went into a store in Attleboro, Massachusetts about 6 weeks ago. Amazing store. And it was so clear to me that no one was incented to sell me product and no one was trained. I'll tell you why. Gorgeous display on one side. I picked 3 products. They're out of stock. No upsell. I knew going in AOB in the store is $40. I spent $230. Okay. No signage on what's for sale or what's on special. No incentivization. If I was in a car dealer, I was a whale in that store. Like I was probably the biggest single purchase they were getting that day. I would have bought an $80 eight. So there was no process from the bud tender to a manager to be like, "Hey, dude, we've got money here. Let's sell it to them." There was also no pushing the special. So talk to me about how you address those issues because I think it's so. When I go in and I optimize, that's $1 million a year. That's a $13 million a year store, bro. That's another $1 million a year they're missing, right? So talk to me about that before we get off because I think that's really cool.
Absolutely. Well, I very much appreciate the kind words. Yes, I really enjoyed our conversations back when I was raising this Series A. It honestly, gave me a big boost. You were very, very kind, very supportive, and you had great things to say about what we were working on at a time when we were talking to a lot of investors who were giving us that exact spiel that you mentioned at the start, which is, hey, this is really cool. We like this idea, but we just can't really do this cannabis bag. Luckily we found some incredible investors then who were really bought in on us and bought in on the industry and bought in on what we could do, not just in cannabis, but also beyond. The team over at Lightbank who led the Series A and some other folks like, Jason Calacanis and 10110. And that really, drove us into, this era of the tool, which, we really started out so focused on how do we get that in-store employee to earn based on the value that they create. That was, what we were really passionate about. They're creating so much value in these spaces. Like you said, the difference between a, $500,000 a year dispensary and a $2 million a year dispensary is just people who really want to sell the product and want to put it in front of the customer. And that incentivization tool allows the brand to be a part of that. It shouldn't
Yep.
just be the retailer responsible for training the employees, for incenting the employees, for making sure that that space, which is the most important port of distribution for all these brands, it can't just be on them, especially since they're so cash flow constrained.
It's
Um,
not just the brand, it's the companies, right? So like just to interrupt you,
Please.
here was the big reveal. The store that I went to had about 15% of their product that was owned and operated. Okay. And they had a $5 bag of 100 milligram gummies. They didn't try to sell me one fucking bag. I had to beg them for the bag, right? So it's not just the brand, it's the margin capture on your in-store white label as well, right? And if
Precisely.
I've got if I've got a 32-year-old mother of two who's working 2 jobs, who's my bud tender, if I could put another $25 a day in her pocket, that's real money. And it's not that hard, right? So I think it's so critical, man.
Thanks, man. And what we have really learned over time is that frontline employee, obviously it's all about their will and their motivation. That was what we addressed with the Sparks tool. But then we had so many people saying, "Hey, how do I train them?" So that's why we created our courses and education tool, which has been going gangbusters, and all of our customers are loving. And then we started to recognize that there's so much in that physical retail space that is currently under coordinated, under invested, under tracked. People are running pricing promotions with no strategy associated with it. People are throwing out in-store demos and patient appreciation days with no strategy and no coordination. It's such an effort. It's such a challenge. And if you think about what it's like to create a marketing campaign in a digital space, okay, I'm going to upload some content that I, spun up on Claude, and I'm going to put it into meta ads. I'm going to run it. I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to run it again. It's a machine. But these physical spaces where 80% of commerce in the United States, let alone, 90% of commerce in the cannabis industry is still happening, are totally impenetrable. So now we've been able to create this platform that can really allow these brands and retailers to coordinate and optimize on everything happening in the physical space.
It's also because still in this industry, unless you're a very sophisticated consumer, your final port of interaction is human to human trust. I go in there and I put myself in the hand of the person that's selling. I say, hey, what's hot? What's on special? What are you smoking? What's the team smoking in store? What can you not keep in stock? Right. I want to know what's moving. Right. So I'm trusting my experience to the process there. And the CEOs that get that, I see uniform and the brands, because I think you're deployed with Timeless and Groon pretty heavily as well. The brands that I see get that, the incentivization is, again, if you're a 50 million revenue brand and you can pick up another 3 to 4 points of revenue, that's a lot of lettuce, right?
Wow. Thank you, Seth.
Very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the outreach. And please hit me up. And next time you're in LA, let me know. I'll buy you a coffee and an airline. All right.
Will do. Thanks so much, Seth. Really appreciate you as well. Bye-bye.